Cruising in clear skies 35,000 feet above the Indonesian jungle, a 737 suddenly plummets from the sky.
The debris is at the bottom of the river.
Good Lord. Take a look at this.
Evidence points to a serious mechanical failure, one that could ground commercial flights across the globe.
Because of the history of the 737, we were concerned.
But when the full story behind the crash of Silk Air Flight 185 is finally revealed,
2.5 units.
The cause is more disturbing than anyone could have imagined.
It was kind of shocking.
I didn't really know what to believe.
Mayday, Mayday.
We'll be serving lunch shortly.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain. My name is Zhu Wei Ming. On the flight deck this afternoon, with me is First Officer Duncan Ward. We'd like to welcome you aboard, and we are now climbing through 19,000 feet.
Silk Air Flight 185 is climbing to its cruising altitude. The Boeing 737 is carrying 97 passengers and 7 crew from Jakarta, Indonesia to the airline's home base, Singapore. The flight should take about 80 minutes, heading north over the rainforests of Sumatra to Singapore's Changi International Airport.
We'll be cruising today at 35,000 feet.
Zhu Wei Ming was an experienced Singapore Air Force pilot. He'd been in their aerobatic team. He was always listed as an above-average pilot.
Today's first officer is 23-year-old Duncan Ward. The New Zealand-born pilot has been flying with Silk Air for a little more than a year.
Duncan initially found flying at the age of about 14. Suddenly he had a purpose in life. I think that's the best way to describe it.
He came from another operator, already type-rated on the Boeing 737, and when I conducted his induction training to Silk Air, I recognised that he was a well above average pilot as well, despite his young age.
I'll get back to you just before our descent into Singapore with an updated weather forecast. Thank you.
The twin-engine jet is the newest addition to the Silk Air fleet. A Boeing 737-300 series, it went into service just 9 months ago.
At the time, the 737 was probably the most widely used jet transport in the world.
Duncan reckoned that he was the luckiest guy in the world because whereas some people might go to the office in a Ferrari, he went to the office in a 737, so he loved it.
Silk Air 185, maintaining 350.
Silk Air 185, maintain 350, clear direct to Party.
We'll go Silk Air 185.
The flight to Jakarta and back was a standard route. Everything was absolutely normal, absolutely routine.
On flights as smooth as this one, it's common for pilots to get up and stretch their legs.
I'm back for a while. Finish your lunch.
I am.
Some water?
"30 minutes after takeoff, Jakarta Air Traffic Control makes its last scheduled radio call to Flight 185.
Silk Air 185, maintain 350. At Party, contact Singapore 134.4.
Silk Air 185, roger, 134.4 before Party.
The crew is reminded to check in next with Singapore Air Traffic Control.
Singapore Air Traffic Control did not expect to hear from the aircraft for another 5 to 6 minutes, so it was in a virtual no man's land as far as communications are concerned.
Moments later, while still cruising at 35,000 feet. The plane banks sharply and begins to dive.
Cabin crew were probably serving lunch at the time with carts in the aisles. It would have been horrific. The aircraft would have been inverted. Anything unsecured would have ended up in the ceiling.
What happens to all of the people who might be standing up, to the people who are not buckled in? It doesn't bear careful examination. It's too horrible.
At Jakarta Air Traffic Control, Silk Air 185 has vanished from radar. The controller has heard no Mayday call. He tries to get a message to the missing flight with the help of another pilot.
Indonesia 238 Jakarta.
Go ahead, Indonesia 238.
Please relay it to Silk Air 185 to contact Singapore 134.4.
Roger, Indonesia 238.
But the 737 is already submerged beneath the murky waters of Indonesia's Musi River, halfway between Jakarta and Singapore. Local villagers report the crash.
They're telling stories about the aircraft coming very fast from an altitude.
Along the river, people search for survivors, but find only small bits of debris. A 50-ton aircraft carrying 104 people has all but disappeared. News of the Silk Air crash is met with shock in Singapore, home to almost half the passengers. There is very little hope that anyone has survived. "24 hours later, Indonesian investigator Santoso Sayogo takes charge of the team from the National Transportation Safety Committee.
Empty those bags. Put it with the other bags for processing.
What we did is to go to the crash site, observe, and then record and preserve anything that we can use for the later investigation.
Or small debris.
The scale of the disaster soon becomes evident. There are no survivors. All 104 passengers and crew have been killed, including veteran pilot Captain Su Wei Ming and his first officer, Duncan Ward.
It was just complete bewilderment as to how it might have happened. In that situation, you go into a complete state of shock. I didn't really know what to believe.
The NTSC calls in Navy divers and support ships to help with the recovery effort.
The debris is at the bottom of the river. If I can describe it, it's murky water, mud, and the clay. Most of the debris was in the clay.
At the Silk Air crash site, there are no bodies to mourn over. Searchers have found hardly any human remains at all.
It was just something that, as a father, was so horrendous that it just has an enormous psychological effect on you.
The 737 is the most popular commercial airliner in the world. 5 new 300 series jets roll off the Boeing assembly line every month. Having one fall from the sky on a calm, clear day without any indication of trouble sends a chill through the entire industry. Investigators are under intense pressure to figure out what went wrong. Following the crash of Silk Air 185, Indonesian investigator Santoso Sayogo faces the biggest challenge of his career. Fortunately, he won't have to face it alone. Because the 737 is American-made, U.S. air accident investigator Greg Feith joins the investigation.
Mr. Feith.
He's one of the NTSB's top investigators,
Santoso.
with more than 17 years of experience.
And thanks for coming so soon.
Glad to help. I know you guys are stretched pretty thin.
Initially, when we were working with the Indonesians, they had never done any kind of wreckage recovery like this before. We in the States had had a lot of experience with a variety of different accidents.
Investigators initially suspect some catastrophic mechanical failure, but don't know which part could be to blame.
Tough to get the debris pattern. It's all underwater.
Without knowing how the wreckage is distributed, it's hard to know where to start.
We need the recorders.
One of our primary concerns was trying to get the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, because that was really going to help in establishing the course of the investigation, what directions, what elements that we really needed to focus our energies on.
Silk Air 185, maintain 350 at Party. Contact Singapore 134.4.
Silk Air 185, roger, 134.4.
The plane's black boxes, the electronic recording devices, capture every sound in the cockpit and provide a detailed picture of how the plane was flying.
And the CVR and the FDR will record all the way till impact.
Without them, the investigation is crippled. But for the divers on the Musi River, the search is proving difficult.
The visibility in the water was basically 6 inches in front of your face. They had to swim down and feel on the bottom in the mud what they thought were pieces, grab them, and bring them to the surface. We didn't know if we were going to get the CVR and or the FDR.
If the black boxes are embedded deep in the mud, they may be beyond reach. Silk Air flight trainer Peter McMillan joins the team. He has knowledge of the airline and personal experience working with both pilots.
I was basically sent there as a conduit between the investigation and Silk Air to explain any Silk Air procedures to investigators.
To understand Flight 185's sudden dive, he studies Indonesian radar returns that show the plane's flight path.
The aircraft's transponder identifies it on the radar screens, and it can also show the height of the aircraft, and it can actually, with some calculation, determine the speed of the aircraft.
McMillan calculates that the flight time from takeoff to the last recorded radar return was just under 36 minutes.
Good Lord. Take a look at this.
The first 35 minutes are completely normal, but the last 30 seconds of the radar plot paint a terrifying picture.
The aircraft disappeared from radar returns when it went below 20,000 feet. But when the aircraft left 35,000 feet to below 20,000 feet, it gave an approximate rate of descent of over 30,000 feet per minute. The maximum rate of descent is normally in the order of 5, 6, 7,000 feet per minute. So this was a descent of great magnitude.
Investigators determined that in the seconds before impact, the plane was traveling faster than the speed of sound. Investigators are desperate to recover the black boxes. They intensify the Musi River salvage effort.
We brought in heavy assets, which was this ocean-sized dredge, 20, 25-foot bucket that was able to scoop very large mounds of mud out of the Musi River.
But the river is vast, almost a kilometer wide. Even with the dredger, the black boxes may never be found.
They could be anywhere. Siago here.
Boss, I think we found something important, but it's not in the river, it's on land.
On land? Where?
About 4 kilometers east of the river.
We've got debris. East of the river.
They may have their first solid lead.
Witnesses said that they saw parts or things fluttering down that landed in the jungle.
Aircraft debris litters a site in the Sumatran rainforest, just east of where Flight 185 hit the Musi River.
This is part of the horizontal stabilizer.
Be sure to get the GPS coordinates.
We did in fact find that the horizontal stabilizers of the airplane, the two small stabilizers on the back, had come off in flight.
The fragments are from control surfaces on the plane's tail section. Small elevators on the very back edge of the tail help pitch the plane up and down.
We're 4.5 kilometers east of the main crash site.
The distance tells them that these fragments were among the first to break off, a key finding. If parts of the tail broke away at cruising altitude, that might explain the sudden dive. What's more, it may point to a larger problem.
Because of the history of the 737, we were concerned about the horizontal stabilizers having separated from the rest of the aircraft in flight.
Though the 737 is generally regarded as a safe airplane, it has a disturbing chapter in its history. A dangerous malfunction known as rudder hardover.
Rudder hardover means there is a rudder kick to the one side of the aircraft, so the aircraft will have an unusual attitude.
The rudder would actually move all by itself without being commanded by the captain or the first officer through the rudder pedals.
In 1991, nearly 7 years before the Silk Air crash, a United Airlines 737 on approach to Colorado Springs took a sudden roll to the right. It hit the ground seconds later, killing everyone on board. Three years later, it happened again. 132 people died when a US Air 737 crashed near Pittsburgh. Both accidents were caused by the same type of rudder malfunction.
That was a big concern because all of a sudden now you have the airplane doing things that the crew isn't anticipating.
Okay, wrap it up.
Investigators fear that the deadly rudder phenomenon may have struck again.
If the rudder had failed and it had gone hard over, as we had seen in these other events, that would have exposed it to higher aerodynamic loads and would have separated from the aircraft.
Even more disturbing, the rudder problem was supposed to have been solved. Boeing engineers came up with a fix before construction even began on the 737 that crashed in Indonesia.
For the accident aircraft, Boeing already modified the rudder.
So the question is, why would this airplane have had an experience like that, given the fact that it had the modifications to the rudder?
It is now crucial that the team figure out exactly when Flight 185's tail section broke off. Did it detach at 35,000 feet, throwing the plane into a dive? Or did something else cause the rapid descent, causing the tail to break off on the way down?
We had to examine the wreckage, see how these stabilizers came off, and then put that storyline together.
On day 5 of the investigation, there's a major breakthrough. Divers have found a key piece of the investigative puzzle in the mud at the bottom of the Musi River.
The accident happened on the 19th December, and we discovered flight data recorder in the afternoon of the 24th, one day before Christmas.
I can confirm. It is the FDR. Slightly damaged, but it doesn't look too bad.
It was kept in clean water just to preserve the information on it, so it would not deteriorate.
If the FDR recording has survived, investigators should soon know exactly when Flight 185's tail section began to break off.
It's up to the guys in Washington now.
We sent the flight data recorder to our laboratories at the National Transportation Safety Board because the Indonesians didn't have a lab facility like that.
Meanwhile, salvage teams continue to sift through tons of mud pulled from the river, in the hope that the second black box will soon turn up. At the hangar, the search is on for another missing piece of the plane.
Need to find the power control unit. It's called the PCU. I got a photo of one here. And that's what we're looking for.
The Power Control Unit, or PCU, is the component proven to have caused rudder failure in previous 737 crashes.
One of the problems with the power control unit on the 737 was that through contamination or environmental conditions, you could bind up parts of the component.
No one knows if the critical component has been found. If it has, the PCU could give investigators a very important clue. It's been 20 days since Flight 185 disappeared into the Musi River. The dredging operation is being wound down.
There is nothing more they can collect from the crash site, so they decide to stop the dredging operation.
Hope of finding the second black box is all but gone. But at the hangar in Palembang,
That's what we're looking for, thank you.
long hours spent combing through aircraft debris has finally paid off.
Can you wheel that air compressor over here?
Greg Feith can finally examine Flight 185's power control unit, the critical component responsible for the previous rudder malfunctions.
If they had a rudder hull-over, the opening up of rudder PCU will indicate that they have experienced the rudder hull-over.
Feith checks for any sign of contamination or corrosion.
The actuation looks good.
There was no corrosion inside the rudder PCU.
This thing worked fine.
When the rudder PCU was recovered, it was examined by engineers and investigators and found to be perfectly serviceable.
Rudder failure did not bring down Silkair Flight 185. Investigators conclude that the tail debris found on land was ripped away during the plane's supersonic plunge.
Those stabilizers separated from the rest of the airplane at around 10 to 12,000 feet. The aerodynamic forces basically took those flight control surfaces off the airplane, but that didn't answer what prompted it.
The pilots themselves may have left clues about what went wrong at 35,000 feet. But unless the missing cockpit voice recorder turns up soon, those clues will be gone for good.
We are not very optimistic because of the situations at that time.
Hey, Santos, are you there?
Anything to report?
The recorder's been found.
Say it again.
Recorder found.
The CVR was found on the last day of dredging, and it was found under 27 feet of mud under the bottom of the Musi River. It was very fortunate.
The second recorder appears to be in good shape.
The CVR was then handed over to Santoso Ciego, and he and I then accompanied it to the NTSB in Washington.
We had to get them back to the United States to be read out, and we were just hoping that they were in a condition where they were going to give us what we needed.
With the second black box on its way to Washington, investigators may finally have the evidence they need to solve the mystery of Silkair 185. 3 weeks into the investigation, Santoso Ciego travels to the NTSB headquarters to deliver the Silkair CVR.
When I arrived in Washington, the flight data recorder already been read out.
A printout of Flight 185's flight data recorder shows airspeed, altitude, direction, and dozens of other parameters. But there's a problem.
What happened here?
They told me that the flight data recorder was stopped in the air.
For the first 34 minutes and 14 seconds, all the flight parameters are normal. Then, suddenly, nothing. No data at all.
They were at cruising altitude with autopilot on.
The FDR ceased recording approximately 1 minute before the aircraft commenced its final descent.
Investigators are baffled. Why would the flight data recorder on a newly built 737 suddenly stop during a routine flight in clear, calm weather? And why, just moments later, did the plane plummet to Earth? The mystery only grows deeper
Ready when you are.
when the team looks for answers on the cockpit voice recorder.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain. My name is Zue Ming. On the flight deck this afternoon, with me is First Officer Duncan Ward. We'd like to welcome you aboard, and we are now climbing.
It was just a normal flight. The crew were communicating as they normally do, and with the cabin crew, there appeared to be nothing untoward at all.
I'm back for a while. Finish your lunch. I am.
Crew never expressed any problem with the aircraft. It was normal communications as best we could tell.
Some water?
The last noise that we heard on the CVR recording was the snap of as Sue's shoulder harness hit the floor.
After that, the cockpit voice recorder stopped.
That's it?
Just like the FDR, the CVR stops abruptly, but not at the same time. The cockpit voice recorder went dead 6 minutes sooner.
That's almost impossible.
The flight data recorders and the cockpit voice recorders are extremely reliable instruments. Power failures happening very rarely.
On the 737, both recorders are located in the rear of the plane. They both draw power from the main electrical system.
There was nothing to suggest that they should have stopped recording until the airplane went into the water. So the question was, why did they stop? Did something happen in the air to the electrical system that caused the power to shut off?
There must be an explanation. Maybe a short circuit. Find out what you can.
In a maintenance hangar, technicians aboard a 737 run tests on the plane's cockpit voice recorder.
Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, overload. Reset it, please.
They overload the recorder's electrical circuit to see what it takes to get the breaker to pop.
Well, let's run it again. 1, 2, 3, overload.
During the test, they discover that it's possible to overload the circuit and trigger the breaker, but they discover something else. When a power surge causes the circuit breaker to pop, it makes quite a loud sound.
We can clearly hear the signature voice of the circuit breaker pop out.
When the test recordings are played back,
1, 2, 3, overload.
they discover that the CVR keeps recording for a split second after power cuts out.
1, 2, 3, overload.
Just long enough to capture the sound of its own circuit breaker popping.
The cockpit microphone definitely picked up the sound.
The small noise has big implications.
Now let's hear the end of the Flight 185 recording.
I'm back for a while. Finish your lunch. I am. Some water?
Again, please.
I'm back for a while. Finish your lunch. I am. Some water?
Reviewing the final seconds of the Silkair recording, they hear no last-second snapping sound.
I don't hear it.
On the cockpit voice recorder, we don't hear anything at all.
That told us that the electronic device did not fail from an overload where you get a surge in power that could have popped the circuit breaker.
2 recorders on 2 separate circuits failed within minutes of each other, and there's no evidence of any electrical fault. Pulling the breaker by hand makes almost no sound at all. It leads investigators to an unsettling conclusion.
The only remaining possibility is that it was manually tripped.
Someone in the cockpit disabled the recorders on purpose.
We couldn't find any physical evidence as to why those boxes would have failed from a component standpoint.
You know what this means?
I do. I don't like it, but I do.
It didn't pop because of an overload or a surge, but in fact somebody would have manually manipulated the circuit breaker to shut down each of the boxes from recording.
It's against the laws of commercial aviation to tamper with the flight recorders. Investigators have a disturbing theory about why the recorders were disabled. They use a Boeing flight simulator to prove it.
Okay. Let's input Silk Air Flight 185.
We took the data that we were able to get from the radar information and we fed it into this motion simulator to try and understand better the flight path of the airplane during its spiraling descent into the Musi River.
They fly a simulation to see what could cause a 737 to quickly drop from 35,000 feet to just below 20,000. Silk Air's last radar return.
Trigger yaw damper failure, please.
They simulate a sudden mechanical failure and watch to see if the flight will follow the deadly path of Flight 185.
Not even close.
They test more than 20 different scenarios.
And they completed exercises with simulated rudder hardovers and yaw damper failures and various failures of other systems. But under each of those conditions, they are unable to meet the parameters as recorded on radar.
They find there's only one way to make a 737 drop as steeply and quickly as Silk Air 185.
This time, no failure. Sustained pilot input only.
The only plausible trajectory that can match is by using pilot control.
It takes an extraordinary effort, but by rolling the plane sharply to the right and accelerating to top speed, the test pilot can match the Silk Air profile.
The only way that this airplane could maintain a nose-down attitude in a high-speed dive was if somebody had flown it into that position.
An air disaster that took the lives of 104 people is beginning to look like a deliberate act by a skilled pilot.
That changed the complexion of the investigation.
Before they can make a final judgment on the cause of the crash, investigators need physical proof. They find it in the plane's tail section. The salvage operation has retrieved almost 75% of the 737, including a key part from the tail that could confirm if Flight 185 was in a commanded dive before it hit the water.
God. One of the telltale pieces of evidence that we found was the trim jack screw for the horizontal stabilizer.
The jack screw is a threaded rod connected to the horizontal stabilizer. It rotates when pilots press a trim switch on their control column. As it turns, it moves the stabilizer up or down, changing the pitch of the aircraft. Fythe calculates the final pitch angle on the stabilizer based on the jack screw's last setting.
It's 2.5 units. It was moved deliberately to nose down from level flight.
What we found was that the trim was full nose down trim.
The stabilizer trim would have been in the cruise position. There was really no reason for it to move forward.
It confirms that while cruising at 35,000 feet, one of the pilots initiated the plane's dive by moving the stabilizer down. The Silk Air disaster has taken on a chilling new dimension. Evan Byrne is a psychologist and human performance investigator for the NTSB.
It was becoming clear that the flight crew's performance could not be ruled out as a potential cause of the accident.
One of the two pilots likely crashed the plane on purpose, killing everyone on board.
Throughout our investigation, we are looking at both pilots, their professional background, their personal background, what activities they were performing in the days before the accident.
They looked at everything. They examined everything in great detail. I had great confidence in the NTSB. I had great confidence in the technical investigators themselves.
Went back for a while. Finish your lunch.
I am.
Some water?
The last conversation on the CVR indicates that First Officer Ward was alone shortly before the plane went into a dive.
Silk Air 185.
5 minutes later, Ward was still on headset.
134.4.
Silk Air 185, Roger, 134.
And 2 minutes after that, the plane fell into a dive. The key question: who was at the controls?
Tell me a bit about Duncan.
The questions related to every aspect of Duncan's state of mind and psychology. Also trying to establish whether or not he had any possible motive for trying to sabotage the aircraft.
And did he seem at all depressed in recent weeks?
Byrne finds that Duncan Ward got on well with colleagues. He had no debts and no history of depression.
His co-workers, pilots that he flew with, were all highly positive about his performance and skills in the cockpit.
He learns that Su Wei Ming was a married father of 3 school-age boys.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain.
At Silk Air, the former Air Force Top Gun was on the fast track. But as they learn from a former colleague, Ming's record was not spotless.
What was Ming like to fly with?
He was known as a pilot who liked to push the envelope as far as increasing speed to try to complete flights faster than others.
I did hear reports from other pilots that he did try to cut corners at times by cutting sector times, cruising at increased speed.
Investigators learned that 6 months before the Silk Air disaster, Ming had made a fast, swerving landing. He flew in so fast that it made passengers sick.
I disagree. The landing was fine.
The airline took disciplinary action.
When the company investigated, Su Wei Ming was demoted from a line instructor pilot to an ordinary line captain.
Investigators dig deeper.
We learned that the captain was under significant financial stress about the time of the accident.
The trouble stemmed from high-risk online securities trading. Over the last 4 years, Ming had lost more than $1 million.
Shortly before the accident, for the second time in 1997, Captain Su's trading privileges in the Singapore stock market was suspended because of debts that he'd accumulated.
They learned that on the morning of the flight, Su Wei Ming had promised to repay the debt as soon as he got back to Singapore. But the date of the crash was important for another reason as well.
The Silk Air accident occurred on the 19th of December, which was also a significant date in Captain Su's Air Force career.
18 years earlier to the day, on December the 19th, 1979, Su Wei Ming took off on an Air Force training mission with 3 other fighter pilots.
But he had to turn back during the course of that flight because of a mechanical problem with his airplane. Yet his compatriots kept on going.
Ming's squadron mates were all killed on that mission when their fighters slammed into a cloud-covered mountain.
At least 2 of the pilots on board would have been very close friends to Captain Su.
One of 2 Silk Air pilots committed a brutal, callous act.
Safe to say that Ward is not our guy.
Though the evidence is circumstantial, investigators are convinced. Su Wei Ming is the one responsible for the murder of 97 passengers and 7 crew. But how exactly did he manage to carry out such a horrendous crime? No one can know for certain what happened aboard Flight 185. But investigators have a likely scenario.
Silk Air 185 maintaining 350.
It has been 6 months since Su Wei-ming was demoted by the airline.
Such a demotion to an up-and-coming Singapore pilot would be a major blow to his morale.
Silk Air 185, maintain 350. Clear direct to Part E.
The 1997 Asian financial crisis has thrown the region's economies into turmoil. The Singapore stock market has taken a beating. Traders like Ming are hurting.
The stresses in Captain Su's financial background may have served as a distraction. It may have affected his performance in other ways as well.
Piloting a jet on the anniversary of the day he cheated death 18 years ago, Ming makes a fateful decision.
Went back for a while. Finish your lunch.
I am.
Some water?
If he was going back, his right hand would have probably been within inches of the cockpit voice recorder circuit breaker.
It's not difficult to pull one of those leaving the cockpit without the other pilot being aware of it.
Silk Air 185 at Part E, contact Singapore 134.4.
Silk Air 185 Roger, 134.4.
Ming waits until after the last radio call before returning to the cockpit.
Duncan, there's a problem in the galley.
He could easily have said to Duncan, "Lord, the girls want to see you in the back. There may be a leaky tap," or something like that.
All the person remaining in the cockpit has to do is to lock the door.
If the circuit breaker to the flight data recorder is pulled, it eliminates a master caution. There's one in front of each pilot, so that's why he really couldn't do that while there was another pilot in the cockpit.
The cockpit voice recorder was no longer recording. The flight data recorder was no longer recording.
Ming wants no record of what he's about to do next.
The flight profile is one that Su Wei-ming would have been quite familiar with because he'd been in the Singapore Air Force.
Less than a minute after disabling the FDR, Ming puts the 737 into a hard right roll.
He placed it in an inverted dive, approximately 80 degrees, nose down, and he had to use considerable force on the control column to keep it there.
Duncan Ward now has no hope of saving the plane.
I know that he would have done whatever he could.
It's all over in less than a minute. Three years after the Silk Air disaster, Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee releases a report that comes to a surprising conclusion.
We submit to the chairman, but the chairman seems doesn't like what we submitted.
The chairman of Indonesia's NTSC overrules his investigators, declaring in the report that the crash cannot be explained. He argues that the cause can't be known because the final seconds of the flight were not recorded.
It was kind of shocking.
This was a political cover-up. I think there's no other word for it.
In an unprecedented move, the NTSB publicly contradicts the Indonesian report.
I authored, on behalf of the NTSB, a very long document explaining that this was an intentional act, not an accident.
I don't think any sane investigator would find any other cause for the crash.
Air accident investigators can only offer conclusions based on the evidence they have. The Silk Air disaster is a reminder that sometimes evidence can point different people in different directions.
If you wish to do somebody a great harm, you couldn't do much more than to kill one of their children and then try and cover up that fact and lie about it. I know that Duncan would have wanted the truth to come out.